If you can fly, I'll give you the plane. Thomas Whitmore pointed to the 62-year-old black woman who was standing quietly observing the shining executive jet, and his laughter reverberated through the exclusive hangar like a thunderclap of disdain. In front of the $20 million Cessna Citation X Plus, Deborah Williams remained still. Under the Miami hangar's halogen lights, her grizzled hands gripped a battered plastic bag. The Italian suits of the business people at the aircraft sales demonstration were a sharp contrast to his threadbare coat. As she walked over to look out the open window at the cockpit, the nasty remark was made. Her attendance at the special event for affluent buyers was deemed inappropriate by Whitmore, who possessed a personal fleet of aircraft and was the heir to an oil fortune. "Look at that," he added, making theatrical motions to the other people. The visitors' laughter grew as they said, "You must be lost. This isn't exactly the kind of place where people like his usually hang out." The sight was viewed as if it were organized entertainment, by middle-aged men sporting Rolex watches and women decked out in high-end jewelry. Jennifer, the salesperson at the dealership, tried to subtly indicate security. Deborah inhaled deeply as he looked over the aircraft with a familiarity that no one there could really understand. His fingers nearly brushed the fuselage, and there was something about the way she studied the controls that showed much more than it seemed. For 47 years, she whispered, to herself, more than to anybody else. "What?" Whitmore walked up haughtily and asked, "Are you referring to her age or the amount of time it will take her to comprehend the operation of an actual aeroplane?" More deliberate humiliation, more laughs. Deborah, however, kept her gaze fixed on the plane. He displayed a mute intensity in his eyes, as though every slight merely stoked a well-concealed inner fire. 47 years flying, she repeated, this time loud enough for everyone to hear. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds before exploding into even louder laughter. Whitmore doubled over, clutching his stomach as if she had heard the most absurd joke of her life. "Flying?" He shouted between laughs. She said, "Flying," as if she's ever set foot on a plane that wasn't the cheapest airline possible. It was then that something changed in Deborah's expression. It wasn't anger or fear, but a dangerous calm that made some of those present feel inexplicably uncomfortable. It was the serenity of someone who carries secrets too powerful to be revealed at the wrong moment. "If you're so sure I can't fly," she said, her voice firm, "why not make her joke interesting?" Like a silent bomb, the provocation dropped into the hangar. Uncertain of what they had just observed, everyone stopped laughing. Her, who should have been intimidated and leaving in shame, had just challenged one of the richest men in Miami in front of witnesses. Whitmore blinked, displaced for the first time that night. His mouth opened and closed as if searching for an appropriate response to something completely outside the script of humiliation he had planned. And there, under the curious gaze of everyone present, Deborah Williams remained silent. Her silence laden with unspoken promises, like someone who knows exactly what is about to happen, even when no one else can imagine it. If you're enjoying this story of twists and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what's about to happen in this hangar will completely redefine everything. These people thought they knew about underestimating those they shouldn't. Thomas Whitmore couldn't stop laughing. The situation had become his personal entertainment for the evening, and he was determined to extract every drop of fun possible from this improvised comedy. He gestured dramatically to the other guests, like a conductor conducting a symphony of derision. "Did you hear that? 47 years flying," he said, dabbing at his fictitious tears. "Perhaps she has been keeping track since she rode the city bus." Laughter multiplied throughout the hangar. Richard Blackstone, another tycoon present to evaluate the aircraft, took a photo with his cell phone. "This is going to go viral on social media," he commented maliciously. "Beggar claims to be a pilot at a $20 million event." Jennifer, the saleswoman, whispered nervously to the security guard. "Maybe we should ask her to leave," but Thomas raised his hand, interrupting any attempt to end the show. "No, let her stay. I want to see how far this fantasy goes." Deborah remained motionless, his eyes still fixed on the aircraft. There was something about the way she observed every detail of the cockpit that disturbed some of the more attentive attendees. It wasn't the admiration of a layman, it was technical analysis. She studied the instruments as if checking a mental list. 47 years, she repeated once more. And this time her voice carried a weight that made he, Thomas, smile falter momentarily. A quick flashback hit her. She was 17, the only black woman in a class of pilots in 1976. The instructors doubted her. Her classmates mocked her. Her employers hesitated to hire her. But she flew. God, how she flew. Ma'am, Marcus Stevens, an older businessman who had been watching the scene with growing discomfort, interjected. Perhaps it would be better. No. Deborah interrupted him gently but firmly. Mr. Whitmore made an offer to her. She's considering accepting it. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer collective amusement. It was genuine astonishment. No one expected her to take the provocation seriously. Thomas blinked several times as if trying to process what he had just heard. You're serious? He stammered, her confidence wavering for the first time. Perfectly serious, Deborah replied, finally turning to face him directly. You said you'd give me this plane if I could fly it. I'm accepting the challenge. The tension in the hangar shifted instantly. What had been cruel entertainment turned into something more serious and dangerous. Thomas felt control of the situation slipping through his fingers. Wait a minute, he said, trying to regain his authority. That was a joke. No one here expects you to actually a joke. Deborah tilted her head slightly. In front of all these witnesses, with $20 million in sales contracts at stake, she gestured calmly to the guests. I'm sure everyone here is a person of their word. Jennifer swallowed hard. The situation was spiraling out of control in a way that could seriously jeopardize the sale. Richard continued to record everything, clearly anticipating that it would go viral for reasons very different from what she had imagined. Thomas, cornered by his own arrogance, felt his anger rising. You have no idea what you're doing, he growled, her voice losing any pretense of cordiality. This isn't a toy. Years of specialized training are necessary to operate this $20 million equipment. With a calmness that contrasted sharply with his increasing agitation, Deborah responded, I know exactly what it is. Cessna Citation X+, Rolls-Royce A305, A2 engines, cruising speed of Mach 0.92, flight ceiling of 15,200 meters. The silence that followed was deafening, as each technical specification was delivered with the precision of an operating manual. The businessmen in attendance exchanged puzzled looks with one another. This was not information one learned from watching YouTube videos. Thomas turned pale. How do you know that? Deborah smiled for the first time that night. The real question, she said, stepping towards the aircraft, is do you have the courage to honor your word when you realize that you have completely underestimated the person standing in front of you? It wasn't a smile of nervousness or submission, but rather the smile of someone who had just exposed the tip of a much larger iceberg. Marcus Stevens murmured to his wife, This is just not right. She is too knowledgeable. Thomas, sensing that he was losing control of the narrative in front of potential millionaire buyers, decided to up the ante. If she wanted public humiliation, he would give her exactly that. Very well, he said, her voice trembling with contained rage. You want to play games? Let's play games. But when you fail, and you will fail, I want her to kneel right here and apologize to every person in this room for wasting our time. The challenge hung in the air like a physical threat. The guests stirred, some clearly uncomfortable with the direction the situation was taking. But Deborah didn't back down an inch. Deal, she said simply. And when I manage to fly this plane, you sign the transfer of ownership in front of everyone. Thomas laughed, but her laughing suddenly seemed forced. Jennifer attempted to step in, saying, Gentlemen, maybe we could. That will never happen, she said. No, Deborah interrupted her gently. Let this man learn that some bets cost more than he can afford. And there, as everyone present watched that unlikely escalation of tension, no one could have imagined that they were about to witness not only the flight of a 20 million aircraft, but the complete destruction of everything Thomas Whitmore believed he knew about power, privilege, and the dangerous art of underestimating those he shouldn't. What those millionaires still didn't understand was that every insult, every laugh, and every gesture of contempt was fueling something much more powerful than his collective arrogance. It was fueling the silent determination of a woman who carried secrets capable of completely rewriting that night and possibly the rest of her lives. The tension in the hangar had completely changed direction. What had started as cruel entertainment now seemed like a high-stakes gamble that no one could predict the outcome of. Thomas Whitmore, accustomed to controlling any situation through money and intimidation, felt for the first time in years that something was slipping out of his control. "Very well," he said, trying to regain authority with a forced laugh. "If you insist on this fantasy, let's make it interesting." He turned to the guests with theatrical gestures. "When she fails, and we all know she will, I want everyone to see what happens when people like her try to play in our league." Deborah remained motionless, his eyes still fixed on the aircraft. Jennifer, the salesperson, approached her discreetly because of something in her posture. She had been selling luxury aircraft for 15 years, so she knew how to read people, and everything about that woman belied her appearance. "Ma'am," Jennifer whispered softly, "he Whitmore isn't kidding. If this goes wrong, the consequences could be serious." Deborah smiled softly as she turned to face her. "I appreciate your concern, sweetie, but some fights have to be waged no matter the cost." Marcus Stevens, the older businessman, watched the scene with growing discomfort. There was something deeply wrong with this situation. The technical knowledge her had demonstrated was not something that could be learnt casually. It was decades of expertise. "Thomas," he whispered, tugging the host by the sleeve, "maybe you should reconsider this. There's something different about her." "Different?" Thomas laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The only thing different is that she has more courage to humiliate herself than I expected." Meanwhile, Deborah approached the aircraft and began a visual inspection of the exterior. His movements were systematic, professional. She checked the tires, examined the control surfaces, observed the engine air intakes. Every gesture revealed a familiarity that left the more curious observers baffled. Richard Blackstone, still recording everything with his cell phone, whispered to her, "This isn't right. She moves as if she knows exactly what she's doing." "Pre-flight check," Deborah muttered to herself, but loud enough for some to hear. Control surfaces free and correct. Tires in proper condition, air intakes clear. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was no longer mockery or disbelief. It was a gradual recognition that these were not words, memorized from a manual, but automatic procedures from someone who had done this thousands of times. "Thomas, realizing you are up there is the true test. But let's set some rules before you contaminate the inside of my aircraft with his filthy hands," he said, making a dramatic gesture towards the cockpit. "I'm listening," Deborah said, staring at him with that unsettling composure. Thomas started by stalking around her, saying, "When you fail, and you will fail, I want you to apologize on your knees to everyone here." Uncomfortable murmurs arose among the guests. Some were beginning to realize that the situation had crossed the line of what was acceptable. "Second," he continued, ignoring the disapproving looks, "you pay for the cleaning and maintenance costs of the aircraft after you damage it. And third," her voice became cruel, "you publicly admit that people like her don't belong in places like this." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Jennifer lowered her eyes, ashamed to be associated with that scene. Marcus Stevens shook his head in disapproval. Even Richard stopped recording, clearly uncomfortable. Deborah took a deep breath. For a moment, something changed in her expression. The lines of fatigue around her eyes seemed to deepen, and everyone could see decades of struggle and discrimination etched on his face. But then, unexpectedly, she smiled. It was not a smile of submission or nervousness. It was the smile of someone who had just heard exactly what she needed to justify what he was about to do. "I accept your terms." She said calmly. "All of them." Thomas blinked, surprised by the ease of her acceptance. He had expected resistance, argument, perhaps even that she would give up. The absolute calm of her was beginning to unsettle him in a way he couldn't understand. But Deborah continued, her voice still low, but charged with something new. I want you to honor your part of the agreement when I succeed. When Thomas laughed, but the laughter sounded hollow. You mean, if... No, Deborah replied, and for the first time, her voice carried an authority that made everyone stop whispering. I said when... It was then that Jennifer noticed something that made her gulp. While everyone was arguing, Deborah had discreetly examined the aircraft documentation on the counter. But she wasn't just looking. She was reading with the speed and familiarity of someone who understood every technical specification. Jennifer whispered, approaching her again. May I ask where you learnt about aviation? Deborah gave her a loving glance and said, Honey, you learn a thing or two after 47 years of flying. Jennifer repeated, 47 years, and then it dawned on her. When did you start? Deborah asked simply. 1976. Jennifer staggered as she made the mental calculation. If that woman was telling the truth, she had begun flying when commercial aviation was even more exclusively female and white than it is today. Enough talk, he said, jumping onto the platform next to the plane. Let's get this comedy over with, Jennifer murmured. My God, but Thomas was too preoccupied with planning his next verbal assault to notice. Deborah approached the cockpit access ladder. Before climbing up, she turned to the guests present. His eyes scanned each face, memorizing every expression of doubt, every smirk, every look of contempt. Just one question before we begin, she said, her voice echoing through the hangar. How many of you have flown a Citation X+? A few nervous laughs emerged, but no one answered directly. It was obvious that these were buyers, not pilots. How many of you know the difference between a full flap landing and a partial flap landing in crosswind conditions? The silence was complete. Now, these weren't casual questions. They were specific technical questions that only his experienced pilots would know. How many of you, her voice became firmer, have saved lives through aviation? Thomas tried to interrupt, but something about Deborah's presence silenced him. There was a gravity to her words that transcended the immediate situation. Because I, she continued, placing her hand on the fuselage of the aircraft, have spent 47 years not only flying, but proving every day that I deserve to be in the skies. And today, in front of all of you, I will prove it once again. She began to climb the access ladder, but stopped on the first step. Thomas, she said without turning around. I hope you have the transfer documents ready, his voice. The absolute confidence in her voice made everyone present exchange uneasy glances. It wasn't bravado or bluster. It was the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. Marcus Stevens whispered to his wife, Something tells me we're about to witness something we'll never forget. After 15 years of selling to millionaires and billionaires, Jennifer knew how to spot real power when she saw it, and as the Citation engines were ready to roar, she was certain that the real power in that hangar was not in the bank accounts of the men in suits, but rather in the cold-blooded hands of a woman who carried decades of sky in her heart and was about to rewrite every rule. Those men believed they knew. What none of those in attendance could have predicted was that when Deborah started those engines, she would not only be flying a $20 million aircraft, but she would also be carrying the weight of a story that would forever alter everyone in that hangar's perception of bravery, dignity, and the true cost of underestimating those who shouldn't be underestimated. The moment Deborah started the engines of the Citation X+ was when Thomas Whitmore realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The perfect roar of the Rolls-Royce turbofans filled the hangar with a precision that only extremely experienced hands could achieve. It wasn't just the sound. It was the way she adjusted the instruments with automatic movements. How his fingers danced over the controls without hesitation. How she checked each system with a sequence that revealed decades of experience. This isn't right, Thomas whispered to Richard, who continued to record everything with his cell phone. His voice trembled for the first time that night. She's doing this as if she were a professional pilot, Jennifer finished, watching through the cockpit window. During 15 years of selling aircraft, she had seen hundreds of experienced pilots. What she was witnessing now was more than experience. It was virtuosity. Deborah activated the hangar's internal radio. Her voice echoed clearly and professionally through the speakers. Control Tower, Citation 907 Alpha, requesting clearance for taxiing and takeoff. Demonstration flight with an estimated duration of 15 minutes. The silence that followed was unsettling. Thomas rushed to the communications control, but the tower's response came before he could interfere. Citation 9R7 Alpha. Clearance granted. Welcome back, Captain Williams. The words, "Welcome back," struck the hangar like lightning. Jennifer let out a muffled cry. Marcus Stevens gulped. Richard nearly dropped his cell phone. Captain Thomas stammered, his face draining of color. What does welcome back mean? Jennifer sprinted to his laptop and started typing furiously, her hands shaking. Deborah Williams, Captain, Commercial Pilot. As she read, her eyes grew wide. My God, what? I'm desperate, Thomas yelled. Jennifer's voice rose in surprise as she read aloud. Captain Deborah Williams, the first black woman to lead international commercial aircraft in the United States. She served flawlessly for 47 years, logged 35,000 flight hours, and served as the Civil Aviation Academy's head instructor until her retirement in 2023. Thomas stumbled as though he had been punched in the stomach, and the hangar went quiet, except for the sound of engines starting up. Wait a minute, Jennifer said, her voice now shaking with emotion. She saved 243 lives in an emergency landing during a storm in 1998. She was decorated by Congress. She has more civilian service medals than any active pilot. Richard approached slowly, still recording, but now with reverence instead of scorn. And we treated her like a beggar. Marcus finished, shame weighing on his voice. Through the cockpit window, everyone could see Deborah performing the pre-flight procedures with surgical precision. Every movement was economical, perfect, the result of decades of excellence that he had been too blind to recognize. Thomas, desperate, rushed to the radio. Stop this now. This was a misunderstanding. Deborah's voice returned calm as ever. Mr. Whitmore, you made a bet. You said you'd give me this plane if I could fly it. Well, I'm flying it. But I didn't know who he was, he shouted into the microphone. Does it matter? The question echoed through the hangar. His offer was based on his belief that I couldn't do this because of his appearance. The color of his skin, his age, his clothes. It wasn't based on his knowledge or ability. The aircraft began to move slowly through the hangar toward the runway. Jennifer ran up to Thomas with a laptop. Look at this, she said, showing the screen. Her has more flying experience than every pilot in this city combined. On the screen were photographs of Deborah over the decades. Young and proud in her first pilot's uniform, receiving awards, saving lives, breaking barriers that no black woman had broken before. For 47 years, Deborah's voice continued over the radio as the aircraft positioned itself on the runway. I faced men like you, men who thought they could judge her for anything except her competence. Thomas ran down the runway, shouting for her to stop, but it was too late. The Citation accelerated smoothly, and in a matter of seconds, it was in the air, climbing in a perfect curve that demonstrated a mastery that left everyone speechless. Holy Mary, whispered Richard, still recording. She's flying like an angel. For 15 minutes, Deborah performed maneuvers that turned that flight into an aerial symphony. Simulated landings, precise turns, a display of technical mastery that brought several observers in the hangar to tears of emotion. When she landed, as soft as a feather touching the ground, Thomas was on his knees on the runway, not in worship, but in utter despair. He realized he had humiliated not only an innocent woman, but a living aviation legend. Deborah stepped out of the aircraft with her usual calm. She walked over to Thomas, who remained prostrate, and held out the keys. She whispered, "You can have his plane." Mr. Whitmore, I never wanted his plane. I only wanted him to know how costly it is to make snap judgments about individuals based solely on their appearance. Jennifer came over with tears in her eyes and said, Captain Williams. I don't know what to say to Deborah, with a gentle smile. Today, you gained knowledge. That's what counts. Red-eyed Thomas, still on the ground, peered up. Why? Why didn't you identify yourself right away? As Deborah retorted, if I had, you would have changed your behavior. And then you would never have learnt the lesson she needed to learn. Thomas Whitmore. Standing humiliated on the runway in front of the living legend he had attempted to destroy, was unable to comprehend that this night would not only signal the end of his conceit, but also the start of a transformation that would reverberate far beyond that hangar, an instruction on dignity, respect, and the fatal peril of underestimating the magnificence that can exist within anyone, no matter how she shows herself to the outside world. The ramifications of Thomas Whitmore's conceit were still being felt 6 months after that pivotal night in the Miami hangar. Richard Blackstone's video, which captured the millionaire's total humiliation in front of an aviation icon, had received over 15 million views. When his business partners saw the films, Thomas lost contracts worth $3 million. Nobody wanted to link her brand to someone who had publicly displayed such bigotry and lack of morality. Built on conceit and familial ties, her reputation fell apart like a house of cards in a powerful windstorm. After her film of the event was shown in a documentary about trailblazing women in aviation, Jennifer, the salesperson who saw it all, was promoted to regional manager. She frequently shared the tale with clients, stressing that genuine brilliance is not accompanied by a price tag. The entrepreneur who first joined in the laughter, Marcus Stevens, went on to become one of his company's leading proponents of inclusion initiatives. I learnt from a woman that, according to his corporate lectures, assessing someone based just on their appearance is the most expensive error someone can make. Meanwhile, Deborah Williams had received an invitation to participate as the keynote speaker at the biggest aviation convention in the nation. Thousands of young people, particularly black women, were motivated to seek professions in aviation by her narrative. The hangar where everything took place was converted into a training facility that now goes by his name. In a recent interview, Captain Williams asked a young journalist, what was the most satisfying moment of that night? Deborah smiled with the same composure she had displayed while humiliated. Dear, it wasn't when I demonstrated my ability to fly. She came to the realization that everyone present learnt a lesson from the encounter that they would never forget. To compensate for her losses, Thomas, on the other hand, had to sell a sizable portion of her fleet of aeroplanes. No one missed the irony that one of the planes was acquired by a Deborah-founded non-profit that trains pilots from disadvantaged areas. In an interview with an aviation magazine, Jennifer said, "There are times when I think about this. The sense of justice in life is greater than any human planning. All of us were altered by that night, but above all, it taught us that grandeur may be concealed beneath any outward manifestation. That night's most important lesson had nothing to do with wealth or flying. It dealt with the terrible cost of making snap judgments about individuals based solely on their appearance. In the most agonizing way imaginable, Thomas Whitmore discovered that a person's character, experience, and dignity are what truly define them, not their attire, wealth, or skin tone. Deborah never pursued retribution. She just let the truth do its thing. He is truly burying himself in his own social and professional tomb when he chooses to degrade another person on the basis of prejudice. Deborah frequently states in her lectures that the finest form of retaliation is to have such a rich and fulfilling life that her critics recognize how limited his own horizons were. Young pilots today encounter not only one of the greatest aviation icons in American history, but also a living testament to the indestructibility of human dignity when they visit the Deborah Williams Training Center. We can always rise above our critics' expectations, know of how many times they attempt to bring us down. A woman who devoted 47 years to the skies had her spirit broken by Thomas. Rather, he damaged his own reputation and learnt that some people are too large to fit into the narrow stereotypes that prejudice has produced. Deborah's tale shows us that sometimes the best course of action when someone tries to undermine us is to show them how wrong they were with our actions rather than reacting angrily. Even if someone questions him, sometimes the greatest win is just being himself. True humility comes from people who have genuine reasons to be proud, as seen that night in the hangar. Arrogance, however, frequently conceals the insecurity of people who have never succeeded on their own. Leave a comment describing a comparable incident he's had or seen, if this story moved him and caused him to consider how we treat others around us. For more tales that demonstrate how dignity always prevails over prejudice, subscribe to the channel. Additionally, remember to remind someone that our looks does not define who we are on the inside.